Today's speaker is Lisa Barnes, at the professor in the Department of Neurological Sciences and Behavioral Sciences at Rush University Alzheimer's Disease Center. And she'll be talking with us in just a few minutes about risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and African Americans. I first became aware of her work because she was featured in the Chicago Tribune's Sunday magazine section called Remarkable Woman. And when I read about her work there, it just really struck me that she would be someone I would want to know more about. I would want to have a cup of coffee with her and hear about her work. So I thought, well, let's see if she'll come and talk with us. I thought I'd read just a couple of remarks she made in that interview so you can get a sense of kind of who she is and how she sees the world. So she oversees a trio of research efforts on minority aging, Alzheimer's, and on disparities in HIV and aging, and she focuses on the brain's ability to know, remember, reason, and understand as it ages. What she'll talk with us about today specifically is her work for Alzheimer's disease and really understanding what are the risk factors for African Americans. African Americans have a higher burden for many kinds of diseases, and we know that they seem to be more burdened by Alzheimer's diseases at a rate of 2 to 3 times. She'll correct me if I'm wrong, but we're still not quite sure why. You know, why is that? What's happening? So she's really changed her initial focus from her initial work, which was on attention and memory in college students, and she switched because she felt like she wanted to make more of an impact, more of a contribution, not only to psychology, but to humanity. I wanted to do something with my life, she said, that would really contribute to society, really make a difference for African Americans, and so that led me to looking at disparities. So we'll hear a little more about her work today, but it's also influenced by her own personal belief system and how she grew up as a Buddhist. She and her husband are both Buddhists. They're raising their children as Buddhists, and so she's very committed to peace activities that help make the world more just and more peaceful. And her inspiration, one of her sources of inspiration, is from her Buddhist faith. She says, whatever obstacle you are facing, you have the power inside of you to overcome it. A big part of our Buddhism is helping other people who are suffering. That is what inspires me to help another person and to know that I'm not in this for myself. That would be my mantra, never give up. So I invite you to listen to what should be a very stimulating talk from Dr. Lisa Barnes.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I almost forgot about the things I said in that article. They are true, however. I'd like to thank Kara and the organizers for the invitation to come and speak to you this morning about the work we do at the Alzheimer Center. As she said, I am a cognitive neuropsychologist by training, and I have been focused on disparities in chronic diseases of aging for over 15 years now. And so I'm going to give you some information just by way of a background. I'll give a very brief overview of Alzheimer's disease and then discuss some of the research findings from our studies, and then hopefully sell you on the point about why it's so important for African Americans to participate in research, in particular clinical trials and studies that call for more invasive procedures. So we've known about Alzheimer's disease for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it's really becoming more of a topic of conversation because of a changing demographic in the world. And here I'm showing you data from the U.S. Census of the population, the aging population, over the age of 65. And what you see are, I don't think I have a pointer, you see 3 different colored bars. So in the early 1900s, people didn't live very long. People didn't live much past age 50, 60 years old. And it wasn't until about 1960 that you start seeing the light blue bar. So the darker blue are people between the ages of 65 and 74. The next color blue is 75 to 84, and then sort of the turquoise color, the light blue, is 85 and older. So in the early 1900s, people were dying because of childhood diseases. Oh, great. Thank you so much. The green button. Okay. So people were dying because of childhood diseases in the early 1900s. You know, if you got some infectious disease or tuberculosis, all they could do is put a sign on your door and say, quarantine, stay out. But over time, as we got better with our vaccinations, our medications, and better sanitation, clean water, people started to live longer. Also, we improved our knowledge about the things that were killing people in middle age, heart disease and stroke. So we improved our knowledge about, you shouldn't smoke, you should exercise. And so as a consequence, people started living longer. So you see, by 2050, it's estimated that there'll be almost, it's hard for me to see this, over 90,000 people over the age of 85 years old. Million, sorry, 90 million, 90,000 million. It's a lot of people, right? So, and so why is this important? Because Alzheimer's is a disease of aging. So we're going to see lots and lots of people with Alzheimer's disease. And another demographic that's happening that matters for us is the society, the U.S. society is becoming much more diverse. So here's more data from the U.S. Census showing the projections of the population by race and ethnicity. So in 2012, those are the blue bars. In 2012, whites will made up 78% of the population. But by 2060, their numbers are going to go down, and they're going to make up 69%. And this is in contrast to all the other racial and ethnic groups, which are going to grow exponentially, some 3 times their rate now, especially non-Hispanic, Hispanics here of any race. That number is going to really increase, and African Americans are going to increase as well. So you have these 2 shifts. You have people living longer, getting older into their 80s, 90s, and you have a more diverse society. And so the question that we are faced with is, how do we prevent Alzheimer's disease? Because Alzheimer's is a disease of aging. Well, in order to prevent Alzheimer's, you have to identify risk factors, things either in the environment, in your body, in your behavior that you're doing that's increasing your risk. And you have to determine the pathways, because Alzheimer's is a disease of the brain. It's operating on the brain to lead to Alzheimer's disease. So you identify the risk factors, you determine the pathway leading from the risk factor to the disease so that you may develop strategies to prevent Alzheimer's. And this could be either you alter a life behavior, something that you're doing or something that you're exposed to, or you identify druggable targets and develop effective therapeutics to treat. So that's sort of the question that we're focused on at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. Now, I told you that Alzheimer's has been around for many, many years, but it was first given its name in 1906 because of this woman here, Auguste D. She was seen by a psychiatrist, a German psychiatrist named Alois Alzheimer in 1906. And she was under his care for about 3 years, and she died, and he was able to look at her brain under the microscope, and he saw these characteristic changes that we now know are plaques and tangles. But a case report that he wrote in 1906 describes her symptoms. He said, from time to time, she was completely delirious, seeming to have auditory hallucinations. When the doctor showed her some objects, she first gave the right name, but immediately forgot everything. In a writing test, she repeated syllables, omitted others. In her conversation, she used confused phrases. She did not remember the use of particular objects. And this is very characteristic of what we see in the clinic, these kinds of symptoms. And at that time, they thought this was a rare disease of middle age. But we now know that what she had was, completely consistent with what we know to be Alzheimer's disease. Now, before I go any further into Alzheimer's, I want to make sure we understand the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease, because that's a question that I get a lot in the community. What is dementia? What is Alzheimer's? You can think of dementia as an umbrella term. It just means loss of cognitive functioning. And there are many different things that cause dementia, all underneath the umbrella. So you can get dementia because you have Alzheimer's. You can get it from a stroke, which it would be vascular dementia. You can get it from Lewy body, and there's, frontotemporal dementia. Then there's a host of other factors or agents that cause Alzheimer's or have been suggested to cause Alzheimer's, but most of these are reversible. If you treat whatever it is, then the dementia goes away. But these in these bigger boxes here, they are irreversible. So dementia is the general term, and whenever someone says, oh, the person has dementia, your next question should be, oh, what kind of dementia? What was the dementia caused by? So Alzheimer's disease is common and chronic, and it usually occurs in older people. It's the most common cause of dementia. It's characterized by slow onset and gradual progression of memory problems, followed by impairment in other thinking skills. But the most important point is that it's not a normal part of aging. You know, I do a lot of work with the African American community, and we've started to do work with the Latino community, and a myth in those communities is that you're supposed to lose your memory when you get older. You know, there's nothing you can do about it, like, you know, you become frail or whatever. But that's not true. People can live to be 90s, 100s, and have perfect memories, you know, maybe a little slower in their thinking skills, but this is a disease of, an actual brain disease of aging. It's not normal. So if you start to see symptoms or your loved one has symptoms, please don't wait thinking, oh, grandma's just senile. That's just how grandma's supposed to be. That's not true. So there's some alarming statistics for Alzheimer's in the U.S. We now know that more than 5 million people have Alzheimer's, and this is probably underestimated because so many people never even make it to medical attention because of that myth that it's a normal part of aging. It's the 6th leading cause of death in the United States, and we know that more than 15 million unpaid family and friend caregivers are affected by this disease. And that's huge. So the disease is not only, you know, having a toll on the person, which is a devastating disease, but also the family and friends who are caring for the person because they're pulled from the workforce, you know, to have to take care of their loved one. It's really very, very awful disease that if we don't do something about in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be faced with a serious epidemic. We already are, actually. So Alzheimer's is progressive. You know, it gets worse over time. And we have had the same criteria to diagnose Alzheimer's for 30 years. But recently, in 2011, we revised the criteria. And it's very similar to the original, except for we now really understand that Alzheimer's is on a continuum. So, you know, you start off normal, but then we know that the pathology in your brain is building up decades before you actually show symptoms. So that's called the pre-symptomatic AD. And then you have a stage, mild cognitive impairment, where you're starting to show some symptoms, some slight memory problems, maybe you're a little slower with your problem solving, but it's not enough to warrant a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And then finally is frank Alzheimer's disease. So we know that it's a continuum across this range here. And in this revised criteria, we're trying to make more use of biomarkers, things we can measure either in the blood, in your cerebral spinal fluid, or in the brain, you know, through imaging techniques, so that we can see the pathology as it's building up decades before you show symptoms or before you would even think to come to the clinic. So Alzheimer's affects primarily memory systems in the very beginning. And the hallmark feature is episodic memory, which is just memory for episodes, things in your own personal life. But also other types of memory are affected. Semantic memory, you know, memory for famous places or events in history or vocabulary. Working memory, which is like short-term memory, and then other types of abilities are eventually affected as well. Now, this is the reason that I am doing this research, as you heard, is that, you know, this disease is an epidemic now in many minority populations, but primarily in African Americans. And in, I don't remember what year it was now, a few years ago, the Alzheimer's Association put out a press release that Alzheimer's was a silent epidemic in African American community. And they estimated that African Americans are about 2 times more likely than whites to have Alzheimer's disease. And this mainly came from data that came out of New York from a big study called YCAP. And this is a study of Medicare enrollees over the age of 65 from 3 different racial and ethnic groups. So they include white, African American, and Hispanic. And here I'm showing you data from their study. There's 3 bars at each age. So you have, this is 65 to 74-year-olds, this is 75 to 84, and this is 85 and older. And the 3 bars, the black bars are for whites, purple are for African Americans, and the yellow is for Hispanic. And what you can see is that at every age category, the purple bar is higher than the other bars, or at least for the black bar, which is whites. Hispanics are higher at age 85. So African Americans are about twice as likely, and Hispanics are about 1.5 times as likely to have Alzheimer's disease and other dementias compared with older whites. And as Kara said, we don't really understand fully why this is, which is why we at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center focus on prevention. Can Alzheimer's disease be prevented? Because if you had a choice between getting Alzheimer's disease and treating it versus never getting it, which one would you want to do? I would want to do the second one, right? I never want to get Alzheimer's. So we focus on, can Alzheimer's disease be prevented by, looking at these different things here. Physical exercise, mental stimulation, social engagement, and I'll go over some of these later. So identifying risk factors may represent a strategy to slow decline and ultimately prevent dementia, but also it's important because it may provide a window into understanding the disparities. If we know that one group is suffering more from a disease, if we know what the risk factors are, we have somewhere to target to figure out why this is. So there are different kinds of risk factors with Alzheimer's. There are the kind that are non-modifiable, things you can do nothing about, and then there are those that are potentially modifiable. Now, the most well-established non-modifiable risk factor is age. There's nothing you can do about growing older, right, except for dying. So if you get older, your risk is going to increase for this disease. We know that about 5% of people over the age of 65 get Alzheimer's, and then by the time you reach 85, your risk has increased to about 50%. So if you have 2 85-year-olds, one of them is at a risk of getting Alzheimer's. Now, what we don't know is it age itself, or is there something that's tracking with age? Is age a marker for something that's happening over time? But this is, it's well established in thousands of studies across the country that age is a risk factor. Another one risk factor that you cannot change, you cannot modify, is genetics. Now, there's 2 types of Alzheimer's disease. There's the autosomal dominant Alzheimer's, and this is when you have a specific mutation on one of 3 chromosomes. And this accounts for a very small number of cases. There may be about 200 families in the United States with this type of Alzheimer's. And the main difference between this autosomal dominant and sporadic is that you get the autosomal very early in your 30s or 40s. If you have this mutation, then you're going to get this particular Alzheimer's. The other type, though, which is much more common that we all hear and think about when we say Alzheimer's, is the sporadic kind. And this is, there's several risk factor genes that have been discovered. The ApoE4 allele, which is that first one, is apolipoprotein E. That one is the most well-established risk factor. And it's really well-established in white populations. The way that it works is you have, there's 3 different alleles. You get one from each parent. So there's an E2, an E3, and an E4. E3 is neutral, and it's the most common. Most of us in this room will have E3. E2 is rare, but it's considered a protective factor. And then E4 is the one that's bad for you. And if you get, one, your risk is increased. If you get one from each parent, then your risk is, 3 to 4 times higher. But it doesn't mean you're definitely going to get it. It just increases your risk. And so we know that this gene operates in whites. It's a clear risk factor. It's been demonstrated in many studies. The data have been much more mixed in African American populations. These other ones are just now starting to come out, in the literature, and it's constantly growing as our techniques for genome-wide association studies develop. We're getting more and more genes. So we're starting to really piece together the puzzle to understand that there is a genetic component to Alzheimer's disease. And this is something that you can't change. You're born with your genes. But a recent study came out in JAMA in 2013 that actually identified a new gene that seems to be operating in African Americans. It's called the ABCA7 gene. And this study was really interesting because it was the first and largest genome-wide association study for Alzheimer's disease in African Americans. Now, we've been able to do GWAS studies in whites for many years now because whites are more likely to participate in research. There are many reasons why African Americans don't participate, and we can talk about that in the question and answer session. But in order to do this study, which took, it takes thousands of people, they had to pull data from about 18 research centers across the country to get enough people in the study. And Rush was one of the centers that donated data. And they found genetic associations on a series of genes on chromosome 19, that same chromosome that's important in Alzheimer's. They found the ApoE, the one that we always find in whites, but they also found this new one, ABCA7. And this result was different from what they had seen in previous GWAS in whites. And this new gene increased the risk among African Americans almost 2 times compared to just a 1.1 to 1.2 increase in whites. The interesting thing is that both ApoE and ABCA7 genes are involved in cholesterol transport. So this suggests a potential pathway that we can target for developing treatments and for prevention studies, because we know from many previous studies that African Americans tend to have high cholesterol levels, for various reasons. So this was really, exciting finding, but of course it's one study and it needs to be replicated to see if anyone else can find it. But it takes thousands and thousands of people to do these kinds of studies. Now, the other reason that we think that African Americans might have a higher risk, and now we're getting to more the modifiable risk factors, is vascular health. We know that vascular health plays a role in Alzheimer's disease. There's been a link with diabetes, hypertension, stroke, and African Americans tend to have higher prevalence of these particular conditions. So it could be possible that because they have these coexisting medical conditions, this puts them at a greater risk for Alzheimer's disease as well. But those kinds of things have to still be studied. And again, we need people in our studies to be able to determine that. Now, at the Alzheimer's Center and other places across the country, we have identified many, many different risk factors, potentially modifiable ones. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I've listed them on the slide here. You see some that increase your risk and some that decrease your risk. You can pick your favorite one from either list. But we like, to find things that you can actually change, something you can do something about. You can take a medication, if you have diabetes. You can, become physically active if you are sedentary and you don't move. So things that you can actually do to change your risk, those are the things we want to find out about. So the question is, rather than how do we prevent Alzheimer's, how do we build a healthy brain as we age? That's what we want to focus on in our research. In order to do that, we need to have studies that include large numbers of people who don't have the disease yet. You want people who don't have dementia because you want to see what causes dementia. You also need people who agree to donate blood so you can test genetics. And also they also have to agree to a detailed assessment of potential risk factors for Alzheimer's, and then annual testing. So we test people every year so that we can identify the occurrence of Alzheimer's and document the diagnosis when it happens. So we have several studies at the Alzheimer's Center, and I'm going to describe a few of them to you so you can kind of understand how we get our data. So the first one is called the Religious Orders Study, and this began in 1993, and it consists of over 1,200 older nuns, priests, and brothers who start the study without known dementia, and they come from across the United States. They all agree to annual clinical evaluation, blood donation at baseline, and some of them get a repeated blood donation. They also all agree to brain donation at the start of the study. You have to agree to give your brain to be in the study. And so far we have gotten over 300 people have developed dementia, they all start out without it, and over time, over 300 have developed. About 400 have developed mild cognitive impairment, and we have over 600 brain autopsies to date. Here I'm showing you a map where all the people come from. So these red dots represent convents where we go. We send a team out, fly them out to these places to collect the data, test the people, the nuns and priests and brothers, and bring the data back to Rush. And we do this every year. These are some of our participants. They are very altruistic, of course. They're excited to be, helping with research and to make a mark for science. You may have heard of, this study is very, very famous, and we've learned so much from them. But they are very, very educated. The mean education is about 18 years, 19 years. And so sometimes it's hard to generalize to the lay population because most people don't have that many years of education. And so we started another study in 1997 called the Memory and Aging Project. And this consists of about 1,800 older people, again, who don't have dementia when they start. And these people come from northeastern Illinois, the collar counties. They, again, all agree to annual clinical evaluation and annual blood donation. And they agree to donate their brain, spinal cord, select muscle, and nerve when they die. We have about 275 who have developed dementia. Another 400 have developed mild cognitive impairment, and we have over 500 autopsies. So what is that? Now we have, over 1,200 brains at Rush where we are able to, look under the microscope and identify, measure different pathologies, and relate it to everything we learned about them while they were in the study. Some of them have been in the study for 20 years, giving us data every year. So it's really a remarkable way to learn about the risk factors and how they are leading to disease through the brain. So the red dots show you where people come from in Illinois, all over Illinois, and we get them from continuing care community retirement centers, CCRCs. You see how, they look sort of like convents. People, they live there. They have all stages of care from independent living all the way to assisted living. And we go and we give a presentation, much like here about, normal healthy aging and Alzheimer's disease, and we take volunteers. Again, they're very altruistic and very happy to be in the study. And the principal investigator for these two studies, his name is David Bennett. He's the director of the Alzheimer's Center, and he's been doing this, for a long time. So when I came to Rush in '99, I was really interested in disparities, but both of these studies are mostly white. And so I, said I need to start my own study of African Americans. And the reason that these studies are mostly white is not because he was not trying. He tries very hard, but the requirement for organ donation, as at the outset, has been an obstacle to getting people in. You cannot do that in minority communities. You have to really build trust, build a relationship, and then you work in the brain donation piece, which I've been able to do. But if I had started that way, they would have laughed me out of the church or wherever I was, talking to them. And so, in 2004, I started the Minority Aging Research Study, which consists of over 700 African Americans. And I tried to make the study very similar to these other two so that we can merge the data to look across race. So they are 65 years or older, and they don't have dementia when they start, and we test them in their homes. Now, African Americans don't tend to live in those kinds of CCRCs, so we go to individual homes or senior buildings, and they all agree to this annual in-home testing, risk factor assessment, and a blood draw. And then after doing the study for several years, I think around 2010, I started to broach the subject of brain donation. And it was added as an optional component. So we can understand how the underlying pathologies that we're seeing in the brain of whites, we have 1,200 brains, can we learn anything about the biology in African Americans, especially given that they have an increased risk? And so, it's been very, very challenging, I have to say. I have probably about 250 people who have signed an anatomical gift act, which is a legal document saying that they will give us their brain, allows us to harvest their brain as a gift. But, you have to wait for people to die, obviously. And, so far I have maybe like 60 brains from African Americans compared to 1,200 from whites, and, we've been asking and doing this for a long time. And even when people agree to do it, guess what happens? The family calls us and they're so upset and, so we're learning a lot about how to do this, but it has really, really been very challenging, and our numbers are low because of that. But, of course, we'll continue to try, and now we're trying to educate families and make sure the families are on board because they have to make the call, but African Americans are very private, and they don't want their children in their business, so it's a fine line that we're having to walk. But this is what we need to do because this disease, it's about the disease of the brain, and you have to actually be able to see the brain after death. So this is where our people come from. We do have a lot of single-family homes, but we try to go to senior buildings as well so we can get more people at one time, because to decrease the travel budget, because, again, we send a team out to do the testing. We never ask anyone to come to Rush. We go to them, and then we bring the data back. And that really helps also with recruitment and retention. So what have we learned? We have learned a ton of important things that I think apply across, all populations. We've learned, we give people a survey to ask them, how often do you do various cognitive activities, things like reading books, reading magazines, playing crossword puzzles, going to the library, things like that. We measure actual activity and resources for the activity. And we have found that those people who report higher levels of cognitive activity have a decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease and a slower rate of decline over time. And this is true for African Americans and whites. So, you hear about it all the time, crossword puzzles, learn a new language, but really, something's happening to your brain when you're doing this kind of stuff. We don't understand the mechanism yet. We're still trying to figure that out, but that's why we have the brain. And so far, the things that we're finding are not actually related to the buildup of pathology. So whatever this cognitive activity is doing to your brain is operating indirectly through maybe increasing the number of synapses or, slowing the rate of degeneration of neural systems. We don't know that part yet, but this is something we can tell people to do. Read more, become more cognitively active, and that will help sort of stave off the disease for a little while. Another thing that we found, which is just really very simple that we stumbled across, is life space. This is a question we ask people: how often do you get outside your bedroom, then your porch, then your parking lot, your neighborhood? I think the last level is outside of your town. So at each level, your life space is bigger and bigger. And we found that people who have a constricted life space have a increased risk of Alzheimer's compared to those, who have a bigger life space. And it could be that people who have a constricted life space, they're sick, so they're staying in their bed, and there's other reasons for that. But this is an easy thing you can do. You just figure out your life space, and it just tells you, get out there, leave your house, go into your community. Also, social activity seems to work across both blacks and whites. People who are more socially active, they go, they belong to organizations like this one, or they belong to groups, they volunteer, they have a reduced risk of Alzheimer's. And then, staying physically active. We've known for quite some time that being physically active helps reduce your risk of heart disease and other cardiovascular conditions. It also seems to be good for the brain. And it's not just going to the gym. It could be something as simple as walking. Walking is a protective factor against the disease as well, and it operates the same in blacks and whites. But there are a host of other factors that we are looking at that are unique or specific for African Americans that we think may be playing a role. And I've listed them here. I'm not going to go through all of them. But I wanted to talk about just a couple of them. And one is, we know there's differences in socioeconomic status. So the years of education tend to be different in older African Americans compared to older whites. Many of the African Americans in my study, they were born in the South and they migrated to Chicago, but their school system it was legal segregation back then. They would have been in school in the 20s and 30s, and so things were quite different then. And so we know that there was less money spent per pupil on education in these states where they came from. And we know, just that the schools themselves looked very different. I have two schools here, two classrooms. You can see a white one and an African-American, and in the white class, everyone has a desk, everyone has a book. And in the black class, there's one teacher with one book. The kids are kind of, gathered around. Now, people can argue about, which one's better as far as quality. We don't know that. But when we ask people where they were born and where they went to school at age 12, we see differences on the performance in the cognitive tests. So here I'm showing you data of African Americans born in the South versus born in the North. And so here, people who were born in the South or were age 12, in the South, they perform much lower on our cognitive function tests. This is performance on about 19 different tests that we take the Z-score, and so lower numbers are bad and higher numbers are good. So people who are born in the North, they're doing much better. And we need to, extend this to Alzheimer's to see if it's an actual risk factor for Alzheimer's. But it suggests that there's something different about the geographic location. It could be quality of education, it could be diet, it could be something else. Another thing that we're looking at in African Americans is discrimination, experiences of discrimination. We are all familiar with the historical perspective and how things were in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And a number of studies have documented that experiences of discrimination are related to poor health outcomes across a wide range of different health outcomes. Visceral fat increases, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It's also associated with poor sleep. So we looked at it in our studies, and we found that it's related to poor memory performance, episodic memory and perceptual speed, but also when we tried to see what the mechanism was, we measured bloods, right? We take bloods every year. So we measured a protein in the blood called C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation. And we found that people who reported more experiences of discrimination had higher markers of this CRP in their blood compared to people who reported lower experiences of discrimination. So it suggests that inflammation might be a mechanism by which the experiences is impacting memory performance. And other people are starting to replicate this finding as well. So Alzheimer's is a disease of the brain, as I told you. Here I'm showing you two different brains. This is a normal brain on this side, and this is an Alzheimer's brain. And you can see that the Alzheimer's brain it doesn't look as packed, right? There's spaces between the sulci, and it's just more atrophy in the Alzheimer's brain. And when you take a cross-section of the brain, you see these huge holes. This is the Alzheimer's brain. This is the normal brain. That's the Alzheimer's is not how you're supposed to look. And so we know, we have, I told you, over 1,200 brains in our freezers at Rush, and we know that by age 85, we have Alzheimer's disease changes are present in nearly every brain that we look at. Nearly every brain has plaques and tangles. We also see infarct, cerebral vascular disease in more than half the brains. We see Parkinson's disease changes in about 40%, and there's a new protein that we just found called TDP43 that's in about 40% of the brains. Now, keep in mind, we're seeing all this pathology, but probably half of the people who die and give us their brain, they never had the disease when they were living. So even though they have all this buildup of pathology, but the disease itself, clinical disease, never manifested. So that means that there's something that people are doing, some kind of reserve mechanism, allowing people to have the buildup of the pathology, but not show the clinical signs when they're living. And that's what we want to figure out. What is it that people are doing, or what is it in the environment that's being protective against these different pathologies? So we just recently published a paper in Blacks and Whites with dementia, looking at the underlying pathology in the two groups. And what we found was that blacks were much more likely to have mixed pathologies as a reason for their dementia. So in the brain, they had plaques and tangles, they had Lewy bodies, and they had infarcts, whereas whites were much more likely to have just pure Alzheimer's, plaques and tangles. And I'm showing you here. So this is the African Americans. The red is mixed disease, and you can see whites, the little sliver there is their mixed disease. They were much more likely to have Alzheimer's disease. Is the blue, this is pure, and this is Alzheimer's with infarcts, Alzheimer's with Lewy bodies. And this was, one of the first studies to show this number of people. It was small, but again, remember I told you that African Americans don't donate as readily, and so this was sort of like real big news. They got a lot of press, but the thing that was important for us to realize was that we were focusing so much on plaques and tangles and one, picture of disease based on who was showing up to our studies. And all the medications are, focusing on plaques and tangles. So if an African American comes to the clinic, with Alzheimer's and we're giving them this drug, it may not work because the underlying biology is different. And we need to know that. It's a small sample. It needs to be replicated. But these kinds of things we have to know more. We can't just keep doing science with the same group of people and expecting that the answers will generalize across populations. And I'm almost done. How is it with time? I'm good? Okay. So something that just happened recently is that, a lot of money has been put into Alzheimer's. We got like maybe $350 billion put towards Alzheimer's disease research. And there's a new project called Accelerating Alzheimer's Research, AMP-AD initiative. And 3 of the 4 projects include only whites. One of the other projects is in mice. And so, these projects, they need the brain tissue, but the cutting edge biology is not being done with minorities in the area where science is moving forward the fastest. And this is really tragic because minorities are the ones that have a greater burden of the disease. And so we have to do more. I have to do more to make sure we can get African Americans enrolled into these studies, to get them, involved and participating so that when we find out answers, we know that it's true for more than one population. And this is not true just for African Americans. It's true for Latinos. It's true for Native Americans. All of these other groups are not included in research. Back in the day, the typical research participant was a white male. And then we found out that, women are different. So we started getting more women. Now the same thing is happening with minority populations. So what's the impact of not being included in these kinds of studies? Well, it's potential that we can increase the rates of misdiagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Right now, a big part of our diagnosis is made through performance on memory tests in the clinic or in the homes. And we know from decades of studies that African Americans tend to perform at a lower level on these cognitive function tests than whites. And so, if you just go by the neuropsychological tests, then you're going to diagnose them at a higher rate. But, you have to understand that, quality of education might be different, behaviors might be different, all these things that you don't typically measure if you're just looking at one group. So you could potentially increase the rate of misdiagnosis. Clinical trials of treatments may be less informative. So, whatever we're finding out, when things come out and hit the news, they may not really be the right thing for a minority population. They may not qualify for that population. And then also currently available treatments and interventions may be less effective. Like I said, if these drugs are very expensive, $200 maybe per pill, and so you really want to know that it's working in your mother if you bring her to the clinic, right? So you have to make sure that we have to make sure that African Americans are being included in these kinds of studies. So what is it going to take to recruit African Americans into research in general and into clinical trials? Well, it takes dedicated researchers and staff from the community. We have found that people are much more comfortable when they have people who are coming to test them that look like them, or who are just familiar with the neighborhoods, because we go to people's homes. And so we hire people who come from the community. We train them to be in the study. So we have across the different studies, we have coordinators who are African American, research assistants, phlebotomists, and nurses, all who comprise our team. And of course they work on all the studies, but we like for them to go to the minority studies as well. And we do also have whites who come to the studies, but we have to make sure they're very comfortable and that they, that there's lots of cultural competence involved when we send whites out to these different studies. It also takes a lot of money. Because as I told you, imagine we have 700 people and they all live across the city of Chicago and, maybe 25 miles from Rush one way. And we're sending out a research assistant, we're sending out a nurse, we're sending out a phlebotomist. We have to pay for people's mileage. We don't actually pay our participants to be in the studies. We do give them, tokens of appreciation, but we don't pay them. So it takes a lot of money to do this kind of research. So our funding comes primarily from the National Institutes of Health, but we also get funding from the Alzheimer's Association, and we get a lot of money from the Illinois Department of Public Health and private endowments. And then finally, it takes volunteers to participate. I hope I've made the case to you why it's so important to have African Americans and different populations in the studies, but without the volunteers, we wouldn't know half of what we know, And so I've been doing this particular study since 2004, and trying to keep people engaged and keep them every year coming back, calling them, it's your time for your yearly exam. It's time for us to come out and visit you to get your memory test. The first 5 years it was simple. But by the time you get to year 10, it's like, oh, not again, but so we're trying to figure out more, innovative ways to keep people excited about, why you should get your memory test again. But it takes a lot, right? So the take-home messages that I want, if you take away nothing from this, these two things I want you to know is that there are many modifiable factors that we are finding out daily that may reduce your risk of Alzheimer's. And, these are cognitive, social, physical, but there are others. There's personality types. That's not so modifiable, probably. But, there are things you can treat. There's all kinds of things. So it's not like it's this, a devastating disease that you can't do anything about, but we need to really put our foot on the gas to make sure we're getting, more details and more studies and, more funding to get this information. And then the second thing is that there's an urgent need for older African Americans to participate in research, especially clinical trials and studies that involve organ donation. It makes no sense to have over 1,200 brains from whites and then having the real heart-cutting, innovative science being done on the brain tissue from whites when we can, we have other populations out here who are suffering. We have to get them involved as well. So how do we get that message out? The research I presented today is not just mine. It takes a full multidisciplinary team to do this, and we have all kinds of people in the Alzheimer's Center working on different facets of these studies. We have neurologists, we have neuropsychologists, epidemiologists, statisticians, neuropathologists, you name it. It really takes a village to do this kind of work. And of course, we have to always thank our funders and then the participants of our various studies, because without them, we would not know anything that we know today. So that's it. And I guess I'll bring Kira up now. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. I know you talked about genetic predisposition. What are the chances, for example, if one of my parents had Alzheimer, is there a simple formula? You could, for example, say that 30%, I have 30% of chance of getting out. Is there any data on that?
No, there's no simple formula. We know that having a first-degree relative does increase your risk. Maybe 10%. It doesn't mean that you're definitely going to get it if your parent had it. It's just, increases your risk. It really comes down to the ApoE gene, whether or not you are a carrier of that. And that still doesn't tell you much, because that's why we don't use it clinically. So unfortunately, the only surefire way to know is if you have one of those mutations, and that's the really rare form that you would get in your 30s or 40s. Everything else is a susceptibility gene that just increases your risk. And first-degree relative is no different. So parent or a sibling increases your risk slightly.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. If we would like to encourage our African American family members heavily to participate in your research for the greater good of science, where could we lead them to?
You could lead them to us at Rush. Kara actually has my email, and so I'll give it to you now. It's L Barnes, Barnes, the number 1, at rush.edu. And what I would do is to then direct the person to my coordinator, and she would set up a session to explain the study and do some kind of a, consent signing and talk about what's involved in the study. We just got refunded for another 5 years, so it'll be going years 11 through 15, and so there will be a small recruitment phase where we'll get more people, but we're trying to keep the same people that we've already had, and we're trying to be a little bit more forceful, not forceful, but approach the organ donation piece a little bit more. Now we have more experience talking about it. We use like ambassadors, people who are in the study who signed up and said, yes, this is a great study. That really helps a lot as well. So if you direct them to me, I will direct them to my coordinator, and then we'll get them in.
Thank you. It's so great to hear you today. I have, could be not exactly a ghoulish question, but it certainly would help if you could experiment on living brains instead of waiting for a person to die. Is there some way, the least intrusive, to perhaps do some kind of biopsy on a live person, on the brain of a live person?
That's a great question. You cannot do a brain biopsy on a person for Alzheimer's, but you can take an image of their brain either with an MRI or a PET scan. And so we do that in people who are living as well. And then, in our studies, we get people to do MRI so that we can measure atrophy, we can see if they've had any real strokes, or anything else going on. And then the PET, we don't do PET at Rush, but a lot of studies are doing PET to see if they can measure the amount of amyloid buildup in the brain, which is it's part of the plaques. I told you that Alzheimer's is plaques and tangles. So, and now we're starting to image tau as well. So, this area of research is moving at a warp speed. So you're right, it would be great to be able to find out while people are still living instead of waiting until they die. But in our studies, what we're doing is we're looking at the brain while they're living, through the images, and then we're looking at the pathology some of the images you can't measure the pathology because it's microscopic. You can't see it. So we have both. We have while they're still living, the images, and then we have the pathology at death. Thank you for your question.
You had a slide that said increased risk, decreased risk.
Yeah.
And the decreased risk are all things that are like good for us in general, like eat healthy and exercise and get enough sleep and all those really virtuous things.
Yeah.
One of the increased risks scares me, which is change in BMI parentheses weight loss. And I feel like if I do those decreased risk things, I'm at risk for losing weight, which seems to increase my risk, and it scares me. So how do I put those two pieces together?
Okay, I don't know that you can put them together. So the change in BMI, it's really very complicated because what we don't know, is it a marker? Like once you start losing weight, does that mean something else is going on? Or is it just that you've lost weight? That's the risk factor itself. There's so many things. When you're sick, you start to lose weight. Your eating habits have changed. So that was a really hard one to think about. I think what I like to tell people is just have a moderate lifestyle. So eat what you want, but in moderation. Cut out the stuff that's clearly bad for you, obviously. Make sure you get exercise, stay socially active. But I would not focus so concretely on each one. Like I have to do this one, then do that one, because it doesn't work in that way. But yeah, the BMI one is tricky, and the literature on that is so mixed. Where people find, some people find it, some others don't. Some find that obesity is protective. So we're still not really clear on that one.
Thank you. I was wondering if we have any international evidence that is helping understand, blacks in other countries and things about like the population incidence of this ABCA7 you were talking about. And
well, that new gene, we don't have anything because that's a brand new gene, but that's a great question. There is a study called the Indianapolis Ibadan. I'm not sure how to say it. It's a Nigerian study. So this is out of Indiana University. Hugh Hendry was the principal investigator. And basically what he did was he recruited African Americans from Indianapolis and Africans from Nigeria. And he is following them, together with the same, well, not the same test, but very similar. You had to modify them for the African population a little bit. What he's finding, though, is that the risk of Alzheimer's is higher in the African Americans in Indianapolis, and is much lower in Nigeria. So that suggests really strongly there's an environmental component to this disease because, the Africans and African Americans genetically share, some common structures there. But so that's the only study that I know of comparing African Americans and Africans. But clearly we need more in that area.
A few years ago, we had a woman, Professor Dorothy Brown, and she wrote Fatal Invention, and she would have a stroke watching this presentation because she says you can't define race. So if we can't define race, and we can't, we really can't. I have grandchildren of color. I have no idea how you or they would define themselves.
Right.
So until we can do that, I'm just very curious how you and your study on Nigeria kind of holds up that point.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a fair question.
And
so in all of our studies, it's self-identification. So we ask the person what do they identify as, and we know that in the U.S., race is a social construct primarily, right. And so it could be a marker for just social experience rather than genetic. There's no genetic differences across the race. We know that. Everyone agrees with that pretty much. So we really think that it's something about social experience, which is why I'm focusing more on, discrimination and other social experiences to try to get a handle on it. But right now, that's how we classify people to different racial groups.
It's time to change.
It really is. You're right.
I see some new hands in the back. I'm going to head over this way.
Hello. Thank you for coming.
Hi.
I have a question more about how close are we to kind of like defining what Alzheimer's is? For example, like I read an obituary, died from complications of Alzheimer's, but that doesn't really tell me much. Obviously, there's a pathology, there's biological issues going on, but also as you pointed out, there's, older people have differences in their brain, which doesn't necessarily manifest because we're kind of defining it by the symptoms, aren't we?
Yeah.
The observable symptoms of what Alzheimer is. And it's under an umbrella of dementias.
Right.
So is there something that we can kind of, for the lay people at least, to kind of get our hands on to say, okay, that's what this really means?
Unfortunately, there's not. And, that's a great question because I'm on a committee now with NIH. We're having a summit at the end of March. And that is one of the questions that has come up. It's like, everyone's confused. Lay people, researchers, clinicians. We all know what it looks like, based on the symptoms and what we see under the brain, but we don't know what to call it. How do you define it? And we need a nomenclature that cuts across all groups. So that's something that we're moving towards, and we're going to be throwing money in the pot so people can start doing that kind of research. But that's a great point. No one agrees. And it causes confusion, right?
Hi. Thank you for your talk today. I have just a question for you. You sort of touched on but moved on about personality type, and like me, I'm African American. We tend to be very, very private, and we don't like to kind of share things with our family and medical stuff. But you mentioned something about personality types. So is that like introversion, extroversion, when you were talking about that?
The personalities that we've looked at, the types, it comes from the 5-factor NEO scale, and they measure 5 different types: neuroticism, conscientiousness, openness. I forgot the other 2. Hopefully, I don't have Alzheimer's. But so our findings, though, neuroticism comes out very clearly. So people who, it's a measure of your propensity to experience distress. So people who are very neurotic have an increased risk of Alzheimer's. Conscientiousness seems to be protective. So, so far, those are the only ones. The other personality factors don't seem to be related. So when you're talking about being private, I don't know if that's actually a personality factor, just a cultural leaning, I would say. And of course, we haven't looked at that. But for personality, those are the only 2 that we've seen so far.
Sorry, hang on.
I don't remember
What's
that.
the increase for neuroticism?
I don't remember specifically what the increase is. Do you think you might be neurotic? Yeah. No, I don't remember what the increase was. It's not dramatic.
Was there a hand up here? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. And my question is, I know today you're focusing on the African American population, but your statistics show that another minority with high risk is the Hispanics.
Right.
Is this study your research focused only in African American, or are you interested in recruiting some Hispanics? Because I have a candidate here.
We are. But unfortunately, you look way too young.
No, not me. My mom.
Okay.
But thank you.
We actually just got funded for a Latino study at Rush, and we have a really great principal investigator, David Marquez, who's working with us. He's at the UIC in Chicago, and the study is very similar to the one I talked to you about, where we enroll people who don't have dementia. We come to your home, we give you the battery of tests, and then, we get blood donation. We ask about organ donation. It's not required, but of course we would love it. And we come every year, and, we're doing that. We just started. So we only have about maybe 40, 50 people enrolled so far. It's brand new, just got funded. So if you're interested, please email me, and I will put you in contact with him.
I think you might have 41 or 51 after that. Who else has a question? Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I have Lyme disease. I'm being treated for Lyme disease, and I just wanted to mention that I came across an article that indicates that 90% of Alzheimer autopsied brains are infected with pathogenic spirochetes, and those are similar to the bacteria that cause syphilis. So I don't expect you to respond to this, but I have a copy of the article citation, which I want to give to you afterwards.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I know there's been some studies on both sides for Lyme disease. We recently published a paper on cytomegalovirus infection, which is a type of herpes virus that showed an increased risk for CMV. And this is a virus that, people get in childhood, and it's prevalent in about 70% of the population. It's thought to be, related to like hand washing. And it's been a lot of controversy about it because some people have found actual CMV in the brains of autopsy patients, others have not. But our study was the first one to show that it's a risk factor for Alzheimer's in people who start out without dementia. So I'd be interested to see your citation. Thank you.
I think we might have time for one more question. Steve, you had wanted one? No? Yes? 2. Okay, we'll let Svetlana.
Thank you for a great talk. Well, can you say more about the resistance to participation in studies in general and to brain donation in particular in the African American community?
Yes, sure. So there's a history in the African American population of abuse when it comes to research. One of the most famous studies was the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was a study of about 40 years done by the government, where they followed African American men with syphilis and did nothing. It was a natural history study, and they told them that they were being treated for bad blood, but they weren't getting any treatment. And even when the antibiotic was discovered, they were not offered the antibiotic. And so, many people died, many families were affected by this mistreatment. And that's just one example. There have been many like that. And so, I am focused on a generation of people who remember those kinds of abuses, and just feeling like you're a guinea pig. That does not resonate well with minority populations. And then, I thought a religious component would play into it, when it comes to organ donation, but I'm finding that it's not so much about religion. There's some people who say that, they want to have all of their parts when they meet their maker, but that's not the vast majority. I think it's really more about if they trust you as a researcher, then they're more likely to want to be involved, and I try to bring home the point that whatever we're learning may not help the person, but it will help your children and your grandchildren, and we want to rid this disease so that no one has to suffer, so what's your legacy going to be? Can you participate for your grandchildren, if nothing else? And so sometimes it takes, many conversations, but we have to be transparent, in what our goals are, and we have to build a relationship where they can trust us. And so that's taken some time. I think people haven't done that in the past. They just come in, try to get the data, and then they leave, but we try to really make sure we have a strong relationship, whether or not we have funding. So even if I lose the grant, I'll still be out there in the community. And I think that matters.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.